Welcome back. Now, in our load menu, we have three widget switchers. Really, there are our own custom widget blueprints that have a widget switcher. But we need a way to switch those widget switchers. And we need an easy way to do so from C++, as we have view models that we wish to do so with. So I'm going to close the editor and go to my load slot view model, which is going to control those widgets that have their view model set to it. Now, I'm actually done with my load screen HUD. I'm going to close that. I'm done with my load screen widget as well. I'm going to close that, and I'm going to get my MVVM load slot, both the header file and the CPP file. Now, load slot is going to want to somehow tell that widget switcher which of its three children to switch to by index. Now, the widget switcher doesn't have its view model set to this load slot view model, but it does have access to it at one point in time when it sets the view model for its children. At that point, it can bind to a delegate. So I'm going to declare one. I'm going to declare a dynamic multicast delegate that broadcasts a single integer, so one param. And it's going to broadcast an index. So I'm going to call this f set widget switcher index. And it's going to pass an int32. We'll call this widget switcher index. And then it can choose from among its child widgets which one to switch to. Now, that means we need one of these as a public member variable. It's going to be an f set widget switcher index called set widget switcher index. And it's going to be a U property with blueprint assignable. Now, which index we switch to, that's going to depend. It's going to depend on data that we may have saved already and what we're loading. Now, we're not saving or loading anything yet, so we really don't have a meaningful index to broadcast. But once we do, we can broadcast this, and I'd like to broadcast it by having a function on this view model we can call to initialize the slot on it. So we can make a public function here called void initialize slot. And this can basically have this class broadcast its slot index based on whatever its status is from when we've loaded in data. So we're not loading anything yet. For now, all we can do is just create the definition and broadcast the delegate. We can just try to broadcast something, right? We can call set widget switcher index.broadcast and just pass something in like 1. But we're going to have to make sure that we check our slot status based on loaded data. So we're going to say to do check slot status based on loaded data. And whenever we actually load data, we'll call initialize slot. Okay, so that's set up for when we're ready to use it. Now, in addition, our load screen view model is going to need some blueprint callable functions for when some of our widget buttons are pressed. We know we have 3 types of widgets, which have buttons, some of them. Let's go into the editor and see what buttons we have. So we can go into Blueprints, UI, Load menu, and we can look at our 3 widgets. We have the Taken, which has a Select Slot button. We also have Vacant, which has its own button. It's the Vacant button, we can call it. And then we have Enter Name, which has a new slot button. So we have 3 buttons, and we need to handle those somehow. Now, we know that the view models for these are the load slot view model. But when we press these buttons, we actually need our load screen view model, the overarching one, to know about it. Why? Because it needs to check conditions. It needs to update the other slots. It has access to the other view models for the other slots. So it needs a function to call for each of these, which means each of these also needs access to that other view model, not just BP load slot view model. Well, this system is flexible enough to allow for that. You see, we can take each of these 3 and we can click plus view model, and we can add another one. We can add a BP load screen view model. We can select that. In fact, we know that we can have it search for its own view model by setting its creation type to property path and setting this view model property path to find load screen view model. And if we can compile without errors, we didn't have a typo. Now, let's do that for all three. We can add that view model, the BP load screen view model, and set the creation type to property path, and set that property path. We'll do that for all three here. BP load screen view model, property path, and there we go. So now each of these has two view models, and that load screen view model is going to be set automatically via the property path. Now this allows us to call blueprint callable functions on it because we have those getters now for the load screen view model. So the load screen view model can now have blueprint callable functions for select slot, for the vacant button or new game button, whatever we want to call that, and for the new slot button. So let's call these select slot, new game, and new slot buttons. So I'm going to take select slot and call this button select slot and check is variable. We'll go to the vacant. We'll take this button and call it button new game and check is variable. And we'll go to enter name. We'll take this button and call it button new slot and check is variable. And we can make blueprint callable functions in our load screen view model for all of them. We'll start with select slot. And when we click select slot, we need to tell that view model what our index is, which we know we've already set. So we're going to go to mvvm load screen. We'll make a new function. This can be void, and we'll call it new slot button pressed. And it'll take an int32 called slot. And not only that, but what else are we entering for new slot? Looks like we started with new slot, right? New slot button pressed. That's actually this one. Well, what are we doing when we click new slot? We're entering a name. So we should enter a name. So this function can also take an f string called entered name. And we can pass it in by const reference, sure. I know that was the first question that came to your mind. And this can be blueprint callable. So u function blueprint callable, not blueprint pure. It's going to do too many side effects for that. So we have this function. Now, we'll hold off on implementing it. We'll just need to make sure that we're calling it when we click the button, right? Now, what else do we have? We also have the new game button. Button new game. Let's implement that one. And when we click this, we need to pass in the index as well. So we're going to make a new game button pressed, void new game button pressed, which will take it in 32. We'll call it slot, and this will also be blueprint callable. Now, in addition, we have a taken, which is a select slot button, and this one should also pass in the index as well. We don't need to pass in any player name or level or anything. This is all going to be populated from our view model. So we're going to make a select slot button pressed, void select slot button pressed, which will take an int 32 for the slot. And this also gets blueprint callable. So let's go ahead and generate these definitions for both functions. And we can compile just to call these blueprint callable functions, but there is one thing we can test. We can test our new game button pressed. Why? Because as soon as we click that plus icon, all we want to do is switch the widget. We want to switch it to enter name widget. So we can get our map called load slots. We can take the index with slot because this is the index of whatever widget we're clicking on. And from this map, we're getting our view model, the load slot view model, which has that delegate we can broadcast, set widget switcher index. We can broadcast that, passing in the next index. Now, for now, we're just going to hard code. We're going to try a 1 here, because a 1 is the second widget. So it should go from the vacant to the next one. So we can compile and launch, and we can test out this broadcast of the delegate, which we do need to still bind to. So back in the editor, we can call these blueprint callable functions. Now, we do need to make sure, though, that we take timing into account. We need to know that at least our view model is valid before we try to bind callbacks to it. Well, we know exactly when that happens, because if we go to our widget switcher, we know right here in the graph exactly when our load screen view model is valid and our load slot view model is valid. It's valid here. And we have a blueprint callable function we can call on each of these child widgets. We added that to the C++ base class, load screen widget. So if we take each of these widgets, we can call, after setting their load slot widget, we can call blueprint initialize widget on them. And we know that they will have their own load screen view models set by this time. So we can call that on all three of them. Here's load slot taken. Here's load slot vacant. And on each of them, we'll call blueprint initialize widget. And that's how we'll know the correct time to bind to assign our onClicked functions. So now that we're calling those, in each of these three, we'll go into our graph and we'll implement blueprint initialize widget. This is kind of like our widget controller set functions we've used before. I'm going to delete those three nodes. And here, I'm going to get BP load screen view model. And I'm going to call, for this one, it's going to be the select slot blueprint callable function, select slot button pressed. And when am I going to call it? I'm going to call it when this button's onClicked event is fired. So I'm going to get button select slot. And it's a wide button, so we're going to get the button widget from it. Type onClicked and assign onClicked. And when this button is clicked, we're going to call the view model blueprint callable function select slot button pressed. So that takes care of this widget. Let's go to load slot, and this is the new game button. So here we're going to do the same thing. We're going to implement blueprint initialize widget. We're going to get BP load screen view model. We're also going to get our button new game. Now this is not a wide button, it's just a regular button, so we can just directly assign onClicked. And when it's clicked, we're going to take our view model and call that new game button pressed. Now these do require some inputs, don't they? Let's go back to the other one. Yes, this one needs a slot, doesn't it? We can pass in our slot index. We'll do that here as well. Pass in the slot index. You probably noticed that, and we're headed over to the questions section to tell me. Now, we've taken care of this one. Now for load slot, and this one has this enter name. We need to enter a name in here. So this is an editable text, right? Let's give this a valid name, editable text underscore enter name, and check is variable. And we can always get the text from it. So here, we're going to say blueprint initialize widget. We're going to get BP load screen view model. And we're going to call the new slot button pressed. So this is the new slot button pressed that we need to call here. So we're going to get our button new slot. It's a wide button, so we're going to get the button from it and call assign onClicked. We're going to call this function, passing in the slot index. and we need the name that's been entered. Now we have this editable text enter name, and we can call get text from it. And we want to get text, editable text. And we can hook that in, and this takes a string, so we'll just convert it to a string, and there we go. Now when we click this, the blueprint callable function will receive the slot and the entered name. Now this is cool, but the only thing we can test is new game button pressed. And this broadcasts the set widget switcher index, but our widget switcher needs to respond to that. So here's our widget switcher. It needs to respond, and we can't assign here in a function. We can't assign an event to a callback here. We can only do it in the event graph. But as soon as initialize slot has been called, we can call the blueprint callable function, blueprint initialize widget, right here on itself. It can call its own blueprint initialize widget, and that's going to result in its event, blueprint initialize widget, being called. And here it can get its own view model. We've stored that variable right here for the load slot view model. The load slot view model is who has the delegate we're broadcasting. Yes, we're doing it in load screen, but we're broadcasting it on the object of a load slot type. So really this load slot view model shouldn't be a local variable, but a member variable. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to promote it to a variable, and I'll just call it load slot view model. We know it's the blueprint version, but I'm just going to use this instead of this local variable. And I'll replace it. I'll replace the local variable with the member variable. And then I can delete BP load slot view model, and then I can rename this one to BP load slot view model. So now this is not a local variable, but a member variable. And now in our event graph, we can access BP load slot view model, and we can assign an event to widget switcher, and it's called assign set widget switcher index. We can assign an event to this. And what do we want to do? We want to switch our widget. And we have a widget switcher right here. It's not a variable. We can check is variable. It's called widget switcher 36. We're going to call it widget switcher root. And we're going to take that widget switcher root and switch its index. So here it is. And how do we switch it? Well, all widget switchers have set active widget index. The function is what we want. And we'll pass in widget switcher index. And then it'll switch its widget based on that index passed in. So we can save all now. We can go to our load menu and press play. And if we click on one of these, then we switch the widget. So that delegate broadcast is working. And now these buttons are calling blueprint callable functions, but they're empty. All of them are empty except for this one that we see is working. So with that, we now have some more things set up, but really the only way that we can progress with this is by starting to save things. Because the only way we can test out the rest of our mechanics and continue developing the rest of our mechanics here is if we can enter a name, such as Steven here, and click New Slot and actually save that info. And that way, if we close down and open back up, next time we open this, we should see a different widget here. We should see the taken widget that shows the name that's been saved, and perhaps some default values or saved values. So that means we need to start saving things to disk, and that's what we're going to get started on in the next video. I'll see you soon.